Is UPenn going back to campus, or everything is Zoom?
For the most
Or
part, we're going to be completely remote. I think
okay,
it's only really the hard sciences where people need access to a
lab.
laboratory.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, we
that's true.
can request if we'd like to teach in person, but for the most part, it's all remote for humanities.
Gotcha.
Welcome. We're just opening the door and letting everybody in now. And
Okay.
in a couple of minutes.
I'm going to stop my video then.
Hey, Rob.
Hey, glad you could join us.
Welcome. Are those classes pretty well subscribed?
Yeah, I think the entire Asian American Studies program is nearly at full enrollment. Um, I think a lot of people are taking the opportunity and kind of looking at the conversation that's happening nationally
Right.
to think about, how can they reinvest in learning about their own communities. And,
Well, it's very interesting.
yeah, I mean, we had even seen that prior to the pandemic. Just a lot over the last year or two. I think there's been a renewed interest in ethnic studies.
People want to know their own story.
Yeah, and I think there's enough parallels that we've seen, and I think it's relevant, and people are starting to understand that they need to know their history in order to impact the present and the future.
Yeah, when I was at Temple, I was in their Asian Studies program, and I mean, I wasn't there during any pandemic or anything, but it was definitely rising in the amount of students from my first year there to my last year there.
Yeah, I was at the TUJ campus
Oh yeah.
fall of 2008.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, I was there 2015 in fall and spring. Well, that was 2015 and 16.
I have yet to make my first journey to Japan, but it'll come.
Yeah, that needs to happen at some
Yeah.
point.
I was ready to go, but
Mm-hmm.
pandemic and all those things.
Yeah, it's a shame.
It really is. I think it's changing our world.
Hmm. So this is coffee and cocktails, right? What's everyone drinking?
I have to admit, I have iced tea. I just need the cold drink.
I'm also drinking tea.
There you go. Nice. I have both green tea and whiskey next to me. So
All right. I'm glad you're in the spirit of it, Greg.
yeah, gotta have a little something.
One of the other projects that I'm working on right now is the Tadaima virtual pilgrimage, and we're hosting a virtual karaoke night on Friday of next week. So if you tune into that, it's free to participate in. I'll actually be doing some mixology, showing some simple Japanese cocktails, including oolong hai.
Ooh, love oolong hai. I have oolong tea in my fridge right now too. That
Whoa,
sounds awesome.
that does sound pretty
I'm gonna
interesting.
put that on my notes.
Kim. Okay, here we go.
All right, it's almost 6. I'm gonna go ahead and mute myself.
Hey, Rob, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Kim.
Good. It's good to see you.
Yeah, same.
Kind of.
It's better than nothing.
Well, I will, I know people are coming in and we are, going to be getting started, but just in the interim, I will start and welcome everybody who is here so far. My name is Lois Giovacchini, and I am the Corporate Relations Manager at the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, which is a big, long mouthful, but I kind of like our other name, which is Japan Philly, which really speaks to the bridges we seek to build to the culture of Japan, to the history of Japan, to the people of Japan. And we're also the caretakers of the Shokuso Cultural Center, House and Garden, which is a treasure to our city, and we take that very seriously as well. So that's who we are. Our group that is presenting tonight is the U.S. Business and Public Policy Group, and we're looking at the issue of anti-Asian attitude, bias, harassment, and we're really happy that we are able to have Rob Buscher here to talk with us about what's going on here in our city and elsewhere around the world. He's a local expert, and he's spoken a lot about these kind of issues and about also some sensitivity we can have when we see racism in our community or encounter it in any way, whether it's directed at us or we're bystanders. So we really wanted to bring this to the attention of our group because it's a problem. And we're lucky that we have Rob. I hope you all had a chance to read his bio because he is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Asian American Studies program. And he's also, as I said, a renowned expert and a leader in the community and a community volunteer who's really passionately concerned about the same issues that we are. So I know people will be heading in, but I'm going to turn this over to Rob so that we can be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you for being here with us, Rob.
Thank you, Lois, and thank you, Japan America Society, for having me on today's program. Really looking forward to delving into conversation here, not just about the anti-Asian racism that we're seeing among the COVID pandemic, but really kind of the historical framework of what has led to the racialization of East Asians in the United States, and maybe providing a little bit more context about how some of the conversations that our society is having at this moment, sort of about the uprooting of anti-Blackness and the movement for Black lives that we've seen come to the forefront in our national conversation over the past 2 months since the murder of George Floyd, that, in fact, this does actually impact the lives of Asian Americans. And as Asian immigrants or Asian American descendants and other individuals who do business with Japanese and Japanese Americans, I think it's kind of important to keep these issues in mind. So a little bit about the formatting of today's program. Basically, I'm going to be providing sort of a historical framework for us to understand what it is to talk about institutional white supremacy in the context of race relations in the United States, but obviously with a focus on anti-Asian racialization, and sort of focusing on how different anti-immigrant sentiments during the late 1800s, early 1900s sort of shaped the conversation around the identities of Asian immigrants and their descendants, as well as the very targeted anti-Japanese propaganda campaign that took place during World War II, which obviously had a profoundly negative impact on Japanese Americans, and actually led to quite a bit of anti-Japanese sentiment that persisted throughout the rest of the 20th century, in particular looking at the trade wars of the 1980s and 90s and the resurgence of anti-Japanese sentiment that was experienced at that time period. That kind of leads us into today's issues because unfortunately, anti-Chinese racism has not started simply because people started calling COVID-19 the China virus. It is certainly creating a lightning rod for these types of incidents to become more prevalent in society, but it's by no means the cause of it. And I think we've seen a lot of this anti-Chinese rhetoric develop over the last decade or more since China became a larger player on the global stage. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk specifically about how anti-Chinese sentiments related to COVID-19 are impacting not just Chinese Americans, but also other East Asian Americans and even Southeast Asian Americans who are being perceived as Chinese, both here in the city of Philadelphia and other places around our country. And finally, we'll kind of end with a brief bystander intervention training where I will be providing some instructions around the 5 Ds that you can practice if you happen to witness an incident of anti-Asian bias or really any other street harassment issue. And then finally, we'll kind of open it up to questions. So I guess I always like to start presentations like this by asking people, how many of you have taken an Asian American Studies course? If you could either raise your hand in the video or give me a reaction if you've taken an Asian American Studies class. Okay, so I see 2 people who have taken Asian American Studies classes. Aside from Asian American Studies, has anyone here? Okay, 3 people, great. Have the rest of you taken other ethnic studies classes? Maybe Africana studies, Latinx, Chicano studies, anything like that? All right, so seeing at least one thumbs up there. I think it's important to kind of understand this is part of a larger framework that we're kind of dealing with in terms of people not really having access to historical curriculum that reflects the true diversity of American society. And, you know, as a mixed race Japanese American, I grew up really not knowing about Japanese American history aside from obviously what I learned at home from my family. But, you know, my schoolmates had no idea what the context was of Japanese American community, the fact that our families have been here for as many as 5 or 6, in some cases 7 or 8 generations among Japanese Hawaiians. And it really created an uneven playing field as far as how people can kind of come to terms with their own identities and make sense of the society around them. So by all means, there's no need to feel shame for not having taken those classes. It's really the failure of the public education system. So that being said, I'm gonna share my screen now. And so I have a prepared slideshow that I'll be presenting to you all. And we'll basically go from there into the rest of the program. So can everyone see my screen? Great. A little bit more about myself. As I mentioned before, I'm a mixed race Japanese American. My great grandparents immigrated from Hiroshima, Japan in the 1920s. My great grandfather came in the 1910s, great grandmother came in the 1920s, and essentially have been here, you know, for a very long time. That's not necessarily the way it's always seen. And I think because I'm fairly white passing as an Asian American, I don't necessarily encounter the same level of street harassment or racism, but it certainly exists. And I think for people with Asian faces, especially on the East Coast, where there are less Asian Americans, you frequently have these kind of microaggressions, like people asking, where are you from? And maybe getting a pushback when you tell them, oh, I'm from Philadelphia. You know, and it's this kind of reality where people still assume that an Asian face means that someone's a foreign national, when obviously that's not the case. I mean, here in the city of Philadelphia, we have over 150,000 persons of Asian American and Pacific Islanders descent. So thinking, though, more broadly about the types of representation, when we look at the AAPI population demographics based on the US Census, you can kind of see why people might be a little confused at that, because the reality is until 1980, the Asian American population made up less than 1% of the total US population. And even now, in the most recent census in 2010, it was just under 5%. So that's the entire country. And you have to imagine that there are regions and localities where there really might be only one or two Asian or Asian American families. Again, kind of thinking about my own childhood, we grew up in a small town on the edge of rural suburban Connecticut. About 20,000 people lived there, and the only other Japanese Americans were my mom and sister. So I think it's not unusual for people in the Asian American community to have this sort of isolation in some ways from the history of their culture, which makes it even more detrimental when we don't learn about these histories in the context of public education. So kind of jumping straight in, when we look at basic facts around the Asian American Pacific Islander community, there's really no connection between these communities, aside from the fact that essentially our staple grain is rice. We are extremely diverse, totally unique cultures, languages, countries of origin, histories, reasons for being in this country. And, you know, every community has its own diversity within it. So even though we are lumped together as one group, we are exceptionally different. As I had mentioned before, about 150,000 Asian Americans are here in Philadelphia, which is about 7% of our total population. And out of that, less than 3,000 people of Japanese ancestry, which includes Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals. When I start talking about Asian America, I think it's important to also contextualize the reality of what Asia Pacific looked like for much of the early 20th century. As you can see here, the Asian Pacific territories were essentially colonized by many of the European empires, as well as the United States in the case of the Philippines, the Hawaiian Islands, and some of the other Central Pacific islands. And it's important to kind of understand that and keep that in context. From a broader standpoint, and this is when we kind of start to delve a little bit into this idea of institutional white supremacy, for the last 400 years or so, Europeans and their descendants have really influenced the way that the world functions as far as global politics, as far as the financial system. And a map like this really helps us to understand the full extent of that influence. Now, looking at North America, obviously the United States has a long history of racism related to both the African slave trade as well as indigenous genocide. And these are sort of two things that are really imbued in the foundation of the United States. Although the British Empire didn't have a clearly distinguished racial hierarchy, the Spanish Empire did. And it's very helpful to understand because so much of North, Central, and South America was initially colonized by the Spaniards. This framework sort of inhabited the space that the British colonized as well in North America, and later, which became the United States. So you can kind of see here in the painting on the right-hand side, it's Las Castas, or the caste system in the Spanish colonies. And this is based on the parentage of an individual, essentially a person born of two Spanish parents from the Iberian Peninsula were considered to be at the top of society and had the most privileges. And the further removed from that you became, the less privileged you were. And this impacted wages, this impacted the types of employment that people were eligible for. You'll notice as we get farther and farther down the painting, the darker complexion these individuals are. And it's also this kind of racial mixing that you see here. So the left-hand pyramid chart also shows that in a little bit more concise way. One of the things that certainly did exist, however, in both the British Empire as well as the United States, once it was founded, is this idea of scientific racism. We had a long period of history when Europeans had been colonizing the rest of the world, and a lot of social scientists used what we would now call pseudoscientific techniques to justify the systemic racism that was used to essentially colonize the rest of the non-white world. And even things like anthropology, which are still practiced today, actually grow out of this type of scientific racism, where the defaults for any of these studies tend to be white European. And although obviously the field has changed dramatically since this time period, we still do see that setting as studying other people, and other people being non-white people typically. So race relations in the United States, we do have a hierarchy, and I think that's become explicitly clear in the recent months since the George Floyd killing. And, we've seen not just in the last few months, but really in the last decade since the Black Lives Matter movement began, there have been a lot of conversations around how different aspects of our society function unequally across different races or ethnicities. And I would posit that this is largely because of this sort of legacy of African slavery and indigenous genocide that still tends to impact the way that people see the world here. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit later about how that continues to impact us today. But the important thing to consider here is that this has traditionally been a binary discussion. And when people are talking about race and racism in the United States, it tends to be a conversation of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. While those are certainly the two largest groups in the United States, and I would argue do have the largest impact on the way that we understand and experience and live race here in the United States, that doesn't necessarily encounter for the tremendous diversity beyond that, right? So we have these two identities that are really constructs, because whiteness is sort of a political, economic, as well as racial or ethnic construct. There are plenty of European immigrants who come to this country today who honestly don't consider themselves white. And if you saw them on the street and heard their accent, perhaps you would not also consider them white. In the same way that there are many different identities beyond that, and Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Middle Eastern Americans, Central and South Americans, and other indigenous peoples are typically left out of these conversations on a broader scale. So as we continue to sort of uproot race and racism, we also need to understand the context of these other lived realities, but also acknowledge that race is a social construct, and there is no real difference between people aside from cultural or perhaps phenotypic presentation. The last thing that I'll say kind of about this conversation of anti-Blackness for now, at least, is looking at this kind of chart, we do see pretty clearly what the reality of the United States is from a chronological standpoint. The time period in which American slavery was legal was exceptionally longer than the time that we've lived since slavery ended. Keep in mind that the worst aspects of Jim Crow legislation and segregation, separate but equal, only went into effect after slavery was abolished. And some freed Black individuals were living with different kinds of freedoms prior to segregation that were then systemically removed from them. Things like the ability to apply for different types of public funding, or in certain cases in the Deep South, the ability to vote. A lot of these issues remained big deals for the African American community, not until just 1954, but really throughout the civil rights era. We see 54 as sort of the start of the civil rights era, but it's not until 1970 when some of the last legislation related to equal housing and equal employment opportunity are actually ratified. So this is all much, much more recent than even this graph would suggest. And we know even now there's still quite a bit of white supremacy, which we've unfortunately seen represent and present itself in some extremely disturbing ways, I would say, in the last couple of months especially. When I talk about racism in the context of white supremacy, I think there's three main kinds of racism that we can understand. Most people understand what overt racism is, right? This is when someone approaches someone on the street or discriminates them because they're a certain race or ethnicity. But a lot of the impacts of racism are the ways that people are kind of quietly being discriminated against by some of the institutions that are supposed to protect them. For example, for a very long time, it was impossible for African Americans and other people of color to get home mortgage loans in major cities that had a population that was majority people of color. Also, we've seen the kind of unequal policing practices that have taken place, particularly in Black and brown communities. And this is another example of systemic or institutional racism. The third kind that I want to highlight here is probably one that people don't necessarily think of immediately, but is, I would say, equally important to the lived experiences of most people, which is unconscious bias. And we all have biases, and that's just how our brain works. There's so much stimulus at any given moment, our brain cannot process all of the information at once. So we have all kinds of cognitive biases that our brain has naturally developed to help us focus in, take in information in a single instant and make split-second decisions. In a way, it's kind of a survival tactic. So for example, when you look across a room and you're scanning the room and you see people, do you recognize their profession? Do you recognize their haircut? Maybe you do if it's a particularly interesting hairstyle, but more often than not, you'll notice if someone is a different race or ethnicity than yourself. And this is part of unconscious bias. Certainly the microaggressions that I had briefly talked about earlier play into unconscious bias as well, and have the tendency to add up as microaggressions that will eventually change the way that someone understands themselves or their identity. So shifting more specifically to the conversation around Asian immigration, it's important to contextualize that after slavery was abolished, African slavery was abolished in 1807 in the British Empire, essentially indentured servitude became a replacement human labor capital, which extended throughout the British Empire. Now, obviously, by this time, the United States had already declared independence, but this is by no means something that would go unescaped in terms of the way that people understood race and identity and the racial hierarchy within the United States. In fact, some of the very same ships that transported Chinese and South Asian coolie laborers to British colonies were also used at one time to transport African slaves. So extremely different. No one came here to the United States like Africans did, stolen from Africa, but there were some similarities that we have to kind of acknowledge as we understand the framework of racism and racial identity of early Asian immigrants. So the Chinese immigration really began after the gold rush of 1848. We started to see a mass migration of both working laborers who were coming over for large contracts, as well as moderate income, middle class, and even in some cases upper class Chinese who were well-to-do, that were descended from the aristocracy in China and wanted to come to the United States to try their hand at making a fortune. Pretty quickly on, there was a lot of acceptance of Chinese immigrant laborers because they were willing to work longer hours, harder shifts for less pay. And ultimately, this made them very popular with the factory owners, the railroad owners, and the mining company owners, but it made them extremely unpopular with the white laborers who were coming as European immigrants or were American-born descendants of Europeans. So pretty quickly on, we begin to see nativist sentiments developing, which lead to segregation, both self-segregation and then ultimately many of the Western territories and later Western states began to implement legal segregation so that Chinese were not allowed to live in the same neighborhoods as whites, and their children were not allowed to attend white schools. So in certain ways, it was actually quite similar to the way the separate but equal, and I'll use scare quotes there, ideas of the Jim Crow South. This also eventually leads to racial violence, and unfortunately, the trade press was a large culprit of the kind of instigation of this sort of anti-Asian racism. In what is commonly referred to as the Yellow Peril, a lot of newspaper companies throughout the country were picking up on these stories around anti-Chinese immigrant sentiments among the white labor, and certain politicians were also pandering to those constituents and began to kind of have this very negative anti-Chinese rhetoric, which then we see being showcased in the news, and particularly in printed news in that era. A lot of political cartoons, the American political caricature just kind of came into its own of that time period, 1860s, 1870s. This is actually from a Philadelphia newspaper, and it shows Abraham Lincoln likeness being tied down with railroad spikes, not dislike the Lilliputians, and shall the last spike be driven, kind of suggesting that the Chinese immigrants are ruining American labor, which we see on his hat. Other cartoons like this one from the San Francisco Illustrated Wasp, which was a political satirical newspaper, shows a Chinese coolie laborer with many hands, working all sorts of jobs, sending money back to China. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of white working class lads sitting around the yard without anything to do. And I'll also highlight this from the same newspaper, showing the realities of immigration on the East Coast and the West Coast. On the East, we see all of these European immigrants coming, carrying signs of labor, industry, capital, agriculture. On the West Coast from Asia, we see this kind of serpent-like being with a Chinese Q braid that was worn by the Qing dynasty subjects, with things like ruin to the white labor, smallpox, immorality written on him. Ultimately, this kind of public pressure from both a political standpoint as well as the journalists and trade press kind of conspired against the Chinese immigrant community in a series of anti-Chinese immigrant laws that eventually culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act. From 1882 to 1892, there was a 10-year immigration ban on individuals coming from China, with special exceptions made for business owners and individuals of independent wealth. However, in 1892, that act was extended indefinitely and actually stayed on the books until 1943, when US was at war with Japan and China became its ally. So in the void of the Chinese immigrant laborers, we start to see Japanese immigration coming in. And I think this is a really interesting conversation because similar to the ways in which the Chinese were valued originally for their hard work ethic and the fact that they were willing to work longer hours with harder conditions for less pay. This is why Japanese immigrants were really valued in places like Hawaii and California and the Pacific Northwest. But eventually, the same kind of story begins to develop. By 1908, the government of Japan makes what's called the Gentleman's Agreement, where they essentially agreed to stop issuing visas to Japanese who wanted to immigrate to the United States in exchange for Japanese immigrants in the US getting special privileges. So unlike the Chinese, Japanese children were actually allowed to attend white schools. And obviously the position of the Japanese Empire at that time period also played a large role in their bargaining power. However, it didn't stop the states from making their own anti-Japanese legislation. With 1913 California Alien Land Law, Japanese Americans were unequally disallowed from owning land. Some individuals were able to skirt this issue by purchasing land in their children's names, but later additions to this law made it illegal for someone under the age of 21 to purchase land. So from pretty early on, there was quite a bit of anti-Japanese impressions in that part of the country. This kind of anti-immigrant sentiment was not only directed towards East Asians. I would also mention that the time period of the mid to late 1910s was one of tremendous regression for the United States. There were a lot of issues related to xenophobia, and isolationist policy really began to rear its head, particularly after World War I. Ultimately, this culminated in a Federal Immigration Act of 1924, which drastically reduced immigration. And essentially, they set an annual immigrant quota per country of only 2% of the number of people from that country that were living in the United States in 1890. So 2% of the total population of any European, Asian, etc. country that was still allowed to immigrate in 1890. And as an example of how that impacted certain European communities, the Italian immigrants in 1923 numbered some 200,000. In 1924, after the law was passed, only 4,000 were allowed into the country. And this was actually a time period where more people were leaving the United States than immigrating in because of these quotas. I should also mention that this was resulting in a total immigration ban on people from Asia and the Middle East until the 1943 Act that allowed Chinese to resume entry, and finally the Immigration Act of 1965 that we'll talk a little bit later. In terms of anti-Japanese propaganda, although obviously there were many anti-Japanese sentiments prior to World War II, what really motivated the ways in which people began to conceptualize, racialize, and discriminate against Japanese and other East Asians on the basis of race is largely rooted in the type of racial caricatures that were used during this time period of American propaganda. And obviously propaganda played a large role in all sides of World War II. Certainly Japan had anti-American propaganda, Europeans had anti-European propaganda against each other. And we also had propaganda that targeted the Nazis and the fascists in Italy. But the principal difference here is that the Japanese are the only ones who are racially othered through this propaganda. And also because of that, it results in an extreme level of violence in many of these images that we see here. It's also important to understand that this violence was not limited or restricted to Japanese nationals or subjects of Imperial Japan. Many of these newspaper articles, defense stamp campaigns just used the racial slur Jap and did make no distinction between Japanese Americans or Japanese from Japan, obviously putting into danger the Japanese American community. We can also kind of see the ways in which Japanese were characterized as inhuman beings, similar to the Tokyo Kid drawing here with the fangs and pointy ears, looking demonic. We see a lot of the propaganda campaigns also talked about this idea of anti-miscegenation, anti-race mixing, and this was definitely an additional factor in terms of the anti-Japanese sentiment. And again, this is the kind of extent of anti-Japanese propaganda where we start to see the faces and likeness of individuals like Hideki Tojo, the general of the Imperial Army on the left-hand side as an octopus, or Emperor Hirohito on the right-hand side as a winged bat monster about to drop a bomb over Pearl Harbor. Japanese Americans were also targeted by some of this, and we can see in particular everyone was involved. Unfortunately, even beloved children's author Dr. Seuss was a political cartoonist at this time. On the right-hand side, we can see a cartoon that he did in 1942 showing the honorable fifth column as Japanese immigrants line up across the West Coast to pick up their bundle of dynamite. Film and television didn't exist yet, but film was used as another means of propaganda and kind of further propagandized both Japanese and Japanese Americans to the extent that it was really omnipresent. And I know these are difficult images to look at here, but the end result of anti-Japanese propaganda was that essentially they had dehumanized the Japanese so much that there was actually a widespread mutilation of Japanese corpses in much of the Pacific Front in a way that was not seen in the European front of World War II. So this practice was kind of referred to as trophy hunting, the extent of which, at least on the Battle of Guadalcanal, over 60% of the Japanese corpses were found decapitated. We can see on the right-hand side an image of a woman who worked as a secretary in World War II in a Life magazine who actually had a Japanese soldier's skull on her desk. So the point of this is that, you know, war is hell, and there's brutality that exists in conflict like this. The fact that this type of trophy hunting was not practiced in the European front suggests that there was a racial aspect to this. And I would argue that the propaganda played a large role in this. So kind of skirting past that into the impact on Japanese Americans at this time period, because of propaganda like Dr. Seuss's fifth column statements, as well as the prevalence of anti-Asian racism in the West Coast, ultimately President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was convinced to issue an executive order 9066, which went into effect February 19th, 1942. Ultimately, this set the groundwork for over 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry to be mass incarcerated in American concentration camps for the duration of World War II. This extended also to mixed race individuals, as documentation exists showing individuals up to 1/8 of Japanese ancestry were also subjected to the incarceration. So I want to clarify, this idea of concentration camp, incarceration camp, internment camp. You've probably heard internment camp the most. This is a euphemism in the same way that concentration camp is a euphemism. The Hitler's death camps should really be considered death camps, right? They're not concentration camps. In the same way that internment camp, by the Geneva Convention definition, refers to enemy aliens of foreign ancestry. Well, over 2/3 of these individuals were Japanese Americans, right? They're American-born citizens. So that definition doesn't really fit. We see other euphemisms like evacuation to describe what could be better called a forcible eviction. And I think part of uprooting this history is being able to talk about it in the ways that it actually transpired. So here's just a map showing some of the main American concentration camps. The ones that are bolded with the triangles are the War Relocation Authority camps. Others were assembly centers, and then there were also Justice Department camps for individuals who might have been Japanese nationals or other individuals of interest in ongoing investigations. We can see pretty clearly, though, that these were prison camps. Women and children and elders were incarcerated here. There were guard towers with machine guns that were pointing inside the camp, armed guards who marched around the camp as well. So the common, I think, ideology around this was that this was done for the protection of Japanese Americans. When we see images like this, we can really understand the reality and the context of what this meant for Japanese Americans. So in the aftermath of World War II and the incarceration that happened then, only 60% of Japanese Americans returned to the West Coast. 40% dispersed around the United States. There were several cities, including Philadelphia, that were actually very hospitable to Japanese Americans. Here in our local city context, the Quaker community, as well as the Presbyterians, laid the groundwork for Japanese Americans to be peacefully resettled into Quaker institutions like Swarthmore College and Bryn Mawr, as well as working at Quaker-owned businesses. So this was a great help to the Japanese American community, many of whom are still here today or have descendants who are still here. So that's very different than the kind of open hostility that a lot of Japanese Americans faced who did return to the West Coast, or perhaps immigrated or resettled in a third location that was not as friendly as Philadelphia. Part of this is kind of interesting to think about in the long-term effect. There's a lot of intergenerational trauma that persists because of the incarceration experience. There are Japanese Americans, obviously, who survived the camp that have been traumatized, but also their children and their grandchildren. They share this kind of trauma because of the reality of Japaneseness being a stigmatized identity. And the dispersal of the community, as well as this stigma, has kind of led to a much wider intermarriage of Japanese Americans compared to other Asian and Asian Americans. So quickly to think about what it looks like in the post-war era, looking back at the normalization of Asian immigration, this is really when we start to see the boom of Asian immigrants coming to the United States. We also see a diversification of where these immigrants are coming from. Prior to the Immigration Act of 1924, there were less than 6,000 South Asians from all of the countries in South Asia combined that were living in the United States. So immediately after the 1965 Immigration Act was passed, we start to see large numbers of South Asians coming, as well as some of the individuals from Southeast Asia. Certainly in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the Southeast Asian refugee crisis, we also start to see a different kind of immigrant refugee coming into the United States at that time period, which kind of intersects with the next period of interest, because when we're talking about understanding Japanese identity and how it plays into this current situation of the anti-Chinese sentiment during COVID, a lot of it exists in rhetoric and journalism. And if you note, particularly in the late 70s and early 1980s, almost every article that dealt with Japanese business, US-Japan trade relations, made use of military language. You can see on the front cover of the Time magazine here, how to cope with Japan's business invasion. Other articles that came in the late 80s and early 80s and late 80s as well made use of terms like economic Pearl Harbor. So this was sort of front of mind for a lot of the journalists. And if it wasn't already for the general public, reading coverage like this presented an overly negative bias on Japan, and for people who lived through World War II, kind of stirred up a lot of the anti-Japanese sentiment that existed at that time period. In particular, the intersection of this with the decline of American manufacturing and the rise of Japanese imports for autos and other consumer electronics resulted in a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment amongst factory workers and other blue-collar workers. It wasn't uncommon to see Japan, or they would say Jap bashing fundraisers where people would pay $1 for the swing of a sledgehammer at a Japanese-made automobile, with the proceeds going towards out-of-work auto manufacturers. And these are the kinds of images that were being shown in newspaper articles at the same time period. As well as objects like this that came back into vogue, wearable pieces of propaganda, buttons, t-shirts, bumper stickers, that specifically highlight this intersection of Japanese military aggression and the current issue of American manufacturing decline. So there's a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment that's happening during this time, and it does lead to many hate crimes that were obviously verbal altercations as well as physical altercations. But the worst incident was actually the murder of Vincent Chin, who you will note was a Chinese American, not a Japanese American, but he was actually mistaken for being Japanese. He was celebrating his bachelor party a week before the wedding, and two unemployed auto workers in Detroit, Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz, started yelling racial slurs at him. He went out into the parking lot and they beat him with a baseball bat, which he later died from his injuries. These two men, although this was, maybe not a premeditated murder compared to some of the other crimes that we've seen happen recently, this second-degree murder charge was dropped to manslaughter, which is the same charge that you might see for someone accidentally hitting someone with a car and that they would die by accident. And actually, they were given no prison time, only 3 years probation, and under $4,000 in fine, which ultimately was a conviction that got overturned by a 1987 appeal. So this is one really unfortunate example of what happens when the anti-Asian rhetoric reaches a boiling point. And perhaps it's an extreme example, but it's not that far off from some of the things that we've seen in recent months. So I know we're a little short on time. I just want to kind of look at a couple of the demographics, and then we'll talk specifically about the COVID-19 issues that we're seeing today. Looking at that population demographic once again, you can really start to make better sense of this data. In 1980, 1.5% of the population was Asian American. That changes dramatically. And so if you're living in a place like Detroit, where there was never a historic immigration of Chinese or other Japanese, East Asian, Asian Americans, then the things you're reading about or watching on television are the things that you understand and accept as reality. It shapes the way that you perceive an entire race of people. And in this particular case, it cost the man his life. Here in Philadelphia, we have a large and growing population of Asian Americans. And you can kind of see from 1990 to 2010, it more than doubled. And we're expecting after the 2020 census that will probably show more than 150,000 persons of Asian descent living here in Philadelphia. Now, that's important to also understand. This is between all of the different ethnicities, right? So we have, again, less than 2,000 Japanese, according to the 2010 census. We have over 32,000 Chinese and only 9 Tongans. I mean, what must it be like to grow up in one of the 2 Tongan families that live here in Philadelphia? It's pretty different. So even though they're considered Asian American Pacific Islander, it's not like they have a community. And it's not like they have the backs and support of those individuals. So I guess my point here is that for these smaller communities, who might be perceived as East Asian, who might be perceived as Chinese, they're also a risk for the COVID racism. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in Philadelphia at this moment. As the news media and certain conservative elements started calling the COVID-19 pandemic the China virus, in some cases Kung flu, actually President Trump started using that term for it on a press briefing that was held on March 16th. In the following 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks of March, anti-Asian hate crimes spiked over 400% from what they were prior to the pandemic. So I think it's important to understand and acknowledge that obviously words have consequences. And although it might not seem like a racially violent action to call a disease a China virus in the same way we might have said Spanish flu, Spanish flu didn't result in Spaniards or other Europeans being targeted for racial violence in the way that Chinese and other Asians are currently being targeted in Philadelphia. Prior to the lockdown that happened in Philadelphia, Chinatown businesses were already working at a reduced profit of around 30% from what they were at prior to COVID. And a large part of that is because of this perception that this is something related to China, and somehow that translates to an anti-Asian bias here in the United States. So the reality for Asian Americans today, particularly Chinese Americans, but really any Asian American who could be perceived as Chinese, is sort of in this state of perpetual hyper-awareness around their racial identity, and living a daily fear that, you know, perhaps today's the day when I walk out onto the street, when I go to the grocery store, when I check my mailbox, someone might yell at me because of the way I look. Someone might, worse, hit me. They might drive their car into me. They might stab me, which actually happened to a family of Hmong Americans that were at a Walmart in Texas. Or a woman in Brooklyn who had an acid attack. Acid was thrown at her face while she was taking out the garbage, simply because she was Chinese looking, and this individual had intent to cause racial harm. So I think, you know, we're dealing with a major shift in the way that we understand how we live our lives because of the pandemic, but there's still certain basic understandings that we need to have about common decency and the reality that our words have consequences. So I wanted to kind of end this segment before we open up to questions from the audience, just by talking a little bit about bystander intervention, and certainly happy to kind of go into more detail if people have questions about the types of hate crimes that are happening here in Philadelphia, because there are many. But essentially, one of the best things that you can do, whether you yourself are Asian American or whether you're an ally, if you witness a hate incident taking place, there are a few different ways that you can help intervene and hopefully de-escalate a situation. These are resources that are provided by a nonprofit organization called Holla Back. Holla Back started as an anti-catcalling initiative to try and help eliminate some of the gender-based street violence that people experience. And in the last decade has expanded to really address all sorts of verbal harassment on the street. So these are sort of proven techniques that do work. And obviously not everyone will work in every situation, but it's useful to keep these in mind as you kind of move through the world at this moment. So the first D is distract. And this would be taking an indirect approach to de-escalating the situation by, for example, sitting next to someone on a train who's being having some kind of altercation verbally with someone, and just totally distract away from the attention of the person who is yelling hate speech at them. You can start a conversation about directions or just comment on the weather. Hopefully keep that conversation going long enough that the person loses interest and walks away. Another technique is to delegate, which is to get help from someone else, usually an authority figure. So if you're in a store, go find an employee. If you're on in a bus station, go find someone who works there, etc., and ask them for help. The third D is to document. So record the incident if you're safe to do so. everyone, for the most part, has a camera on their cell phone these days. So it's pretty easy to access. And in case something happens that needs some evidence in a legal court case, it's helpful to have that. So that's a good way to do it. Also, if someone knows that they're being recorded, they may be less inclined to keep doing what they're doing. Another technique is to delay. So delaying is after an incident has transpired, check in with the person who's been victimized. Ask them if they're doing okay, if you can help them in some way, if you have time to perhaps follow them home to make sure that the person doesn't come back. But essentially, you're delaying them long enough that in case that person who was assailing them it was interested in coming back or was perhaps going to follow them, that they may be less inclined to do so, acknowledging that there's someone else present. And lastly, this is really only to be done if you feel that you're in a safe situation. It's hard to really know that for sure, but if you assess the situation and you feel safe doing so, you can be direct and intervene by telling the person who's doing this to stop doing it, to leave that person alone and to walk away. And again, once this initial direction has happened, you can check in with the person who's been victimized and really do any of the other 5 Ds. So I hope that was helpful. There's also a number of other additional resources related both to the kind of anti-Asian racial climate that we're living in right now, as well as just general demographic information for those of you who are interested in learning more. I strongly recommend the Community of Contrast study from Asian Americans Advancing Justice. That's where my demographic information comes from. Governor Wolf has an advisory commission on Asian American affairs, as does Mayor Kenny, who can provide resources and connections to local community groups. And lastly, the Japanese American Citizens League, which is the organization that I represent, is the nation's oldest and largest Asian American civil rights organization. We help with hate crime reporting and also do trainings like this one that we're doing today. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now, and I would love to open it up to any questions, any experiences that people have had. I'd be curious to learn, for those of you who are Asian or Asian American, what your experiences have been like during this time period in the COVID pandemic, and whether you've experienced any type of racism.
Well, Rob, I have a quick question that you just mentioned, and actually this would have been useful for me to know, that JACL helps with reporting bias incidents. So if someone experienced that, they could reach out to you or their local JACL?
That's right. And actually, I am the local JACL because I also wear the hat of chapter president here in
You wear
Philadelphia.
all the hats, Rob.
So by all means, I will share my JACL email here in the chat in case anyone wants to follow up regarding the hate crime resources.
Thank you.
Rob, great presentation. I mean, with my experience, like, so I'm Chinese American, and with my experience with COVID, I mean, especially in quarantine times, I've been lucky that to not have too much, to not have had an incident. I mean, I stayed inside for pretty much the first 2 months. But you know, my parents live in Manhattan. They really wanted to get back into their regular routines, so they started walking. They did their social distancing walking, and I think the thing that you hit the nail on the head on is that just I think it's the fear that all of this has caused, is that I was very concerned actually for my parents, because the incident in Brooklyn, and then within the Chinese American community, the news that would circulate around certain incidents that would happen, and then, you know, rumors would start flying. So it was a concern. I think I was I was more concerned about my parents, because they, you know, would be by themselves. I mean, they're not in their 60s. They're pretty independent, but, you know, still certainly very, very concerning in the sense of that, you know, I think there was no there isn't a lot of I'm trying to think of the word, is like they wanted so much so to get back to normal that they didn't really think too much about the fear around it. I guess I had more fear for them than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that sort of situation, I mean, there's not much that you can do. Obviously, to inform your parents and give them, you know, regular reminders that unfortunately these things are happening, and there has been quite a bit of anti-Asian violence in Manhattan, especially. But also, I think it's important not to overly traumatize our families, our friends. Kind of keeping these things in mind that, you know, these are certainly possibilities. And we need to be more vigilant now, perhaps, than we were prior to the pandemic. But then again, you know, there have been these kinds of racism and racist actions that have taken place long before that as well. And it doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean that they're safer or less safe because of it. But you know, putting that into context is important.
But I also think there's an idea that if it's not violence if it's not actual physical violence. I think there's a lot of microaggression that happens. That, you know, I mean, growing up in the States, I've had that directed towards me growing up all of my life, and I at this point right now it kind of goes over my head. I don't really let it affect me too much because it happens, like what you said. You know, the first thing many situations have happened where that people would ask me would be where are you from, is the first thing they would always ask. And then when I would say, oh, I'm from New York, and they would be like, but like, where are you, like your skin color, where are you from? Like it, you know, it would always be those types of situations that I think it's the microaggressions that would happen that I don't think people put a emphasis on that happens. And I think it's just acknowledging that it does happen, and also realizing that this is an issue, and you shouldn't just sweep it under the rug like it's nothing.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up too, because I think it's important to remember, especially because we are having this conversation in the context of a business group, right? These kinds of microaggressions happen in the workplace all the time. And if you're a client-facing person in your position and you commit one of these microaggressions, that person's not going to want to keep doing business with you, right? And that's important to remember and to think about that. But also, even for the individuals that are on our own teams, you know, obviously we want people to feel safe and feel comfortable being who they are in our workplaces. And when we commit microaggressions or allow clients or vendors or business partners to commit those microaggressions, we're essentially saying that it's okay, that these things can be swept under the rug. So honestly, when we talk about those 5 Ds, I mean, our focus was really on like hate crimes and verbal assault, or even worse, you know, physical altercation. But the same techniques can be used in any situation like the ones that you're talking about. So I think that's important to remember, that it shouldn't always have to be the person who's being asked the question who then provides that answer. You know, and it's okay for someone to step in and be like, I mean, you know, what do you mean? Like they're from New York. They're from up the street in Brooklyn, or, you know, wherever, right? So that's important to remember. And I think for us in the workplace, definitely a strategy that we can employ.
I have a question, Rob. So, you know, you were talking about the Spanish flu, and I was thinking about, there's been a lot of parallels to the Hong Kong flu of the 70s. Was there anything during that time that expressed similar attitudes as some of the ones that we saw in your presentation?
I've not come across anything like that, and I think that might just be because of the situation at the time period. There were people coming in from Hong Kong, right? And like that was the large group of Chinese Americans that came here. That's why our Chinatowns today historically are still Cantonese, because these are individuals who come in from southern China and from Hong Kong into the US with different immigration rules than what communist China had at that time period. So that's important to remember, and a great question, but I've not come across anything like this. I've done a little bit of research into it, and I'm not familiar with any sort of racial backlash that happened at that time period. So I'm wondering, as I'm sure you are too, why that is. And my thought is that perhaps at that time, Hong Kong was still a British colony and was still perceived as perhaps acceptably Asian, in the same way that, Japan was also very much a friendly business partner in the late 60s, early 70s. It wasn't until the Japanese economy started taking off during the bubble era that this suddenly becomes an issue. In the same way that anti-Chinese rhetoric in the news didn't really pick up until China's economy picked up in the last 15 years or so. So I think a lot of it is sort of this sleight of hand that is commonly used. And if you want to look as far back even as the immigrant laborers in like the 1870s and 80s, the factory owners were making a conscious choice to hire Chinese immigrants and pay them less money than the white laborers. And then they went around and told the white laborers, well, we can't pay you more because of the Chinese. So if you're mad, be mad at the Chinese, don't be mad at us. And that's essentially what's happening time and time again. Like that's the American factory owners, auto manufacturers that are saying, oh, well, we'd love to pay you more, but we have to move our factories overseas and pay people pennies to make the same cars because Japan's too competitive now. And that's sort of what I see also happening here in the China context prior to the pandemic.
Rob, going along with that, did you or are you aware of like the boom of Japanese products in the 80s and their bubble? Did the protests and stuff from the blue collar worker ever come into play with the U.S. government? Like, did that in turn cause any like tariffs to kind of try to offset it at all, or was the U.S. government kind of in like trade facilities just kind of like, nope, this is how it is, this is how it's going to be?
There were huge campaigns politically on both parties, and Democrats and Republicans, that were targeting the folks who were supposedly the chrysanthemum club, which like the pro-Japan lobby was considered at that time period. You had the Japan bashers who were talking about, doom and gloom scenarios and the need to aggressively tariff the imports. And then on the other side, you had the free market economists who then get labeled as these, Japanophiles. The reality is, I think, I was talking to a colleague of mine recently who was actually involved in the trade negotiations during this time period. And he's a Sansei, Japanese American, third generation American, but he spoke fluent Japanese because he lived in Japan and taught English there. And so he had the opportunity to work in a Japanese corporate setting in the 70s and 80s, and actually became one of the lead trade negotiators during the 80s and 90s. And he was telling me, as much as the politicians were talking about this in the public setting, about this like combative language, the United States needed Japan because all of the microchips that were in all of the US military technology were being manufactured in, and still are for the most part, manufactured in Japan. So as much as the, trade hawks wanted to cut relations with Japan, the reality is it was never going to happen. And so much of that was political theater. So I think it's important to kind of extract that a little bit. I guess the unfortunate reality is political theater has real world implications, as we're seeing at this very moment. I can imagine that, the folks who are using the word China virus or Kung flu in a public setting could care less about, Chinese Americans or what's happening on a daily basis here. Their real target is related to trade negotiations with China. And this is their way of putting pressure into the public sphere. Unfortunately, that's also going to relate in Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans facing the brunt of anti-Asian racial violence.
Thanks, Rob. That was super insightful.
Yeah, I would like to just speak for all of us and say thank you very much, Rob. We really appreciated your insight and really putting into that context, too, that there's a lot of economic considerations that are whipped up and sometimes come to the fore. But appreciate those 5 Ds, and I think I will distribute them to the people who came on board.
I just shared a link in the chat which has a little more context on some of the anti-Asian incidents that have happened here in Philadelphia. This was an article that I wrote for WWII early on in the pandemic. So certainly a lot has changed, but at least from April 21, you can kind of get a sense of what that looked like as we're kind of putting this into practical approaches in our local business context.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. And we had a very interesting program.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye.
Rob,
Stay safe.
too.
Bye, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for participating. Bye-bye.